So what technologies make this possible? Number one, this is all really about what we call Web 2.0, which is a really rather vague term, but which essentially talks about user-generated content, the role of the user as the producer of content. So it's the world of blogs and wikis. This is a particular version of that world. It's a transition from primarily downloaded content to uploaded and user-generated content. Another aspect, another technology which I think is tremendously important and also at the same time a cause for concern is the web search engines. Because without the search engines, you could not find any of this stuff. If you were, for example, to Google Jane Austen Google Earth, you would immediately be taken to a wonderful mashup of all of the points of interest in Jane Austen's novels and all the places that have been used as sites in the filming of her novels. But that is something you can find only because Google's search engine allows you. And yet, Google's search engine is already consuming an enormous amount of the power supply of this country and other parts of the world. The Google search engine is currently taking on the order of 1 million computers to run. That 1 million computers have to be powered. Google is starting to behave, as is Microsoft, like an aluminum company, searching the world for cheap sources of power. And so it raises the interesting question, how long will Google continue to scale? In 5 years, will it still be possible to rely on this service to almost instantly search a large proportion of the web for something of interest? That's, I think, a very interesting question. Will we still have this wonderful world 10 years from now? Here's the Jane Austen Google Earth mashup, and you can zoom in on all of these and get some wonderful information about Jane Austen. Another technology that I think was necessary to make all this possible is georeferencing. This is the ability to determine location on the Earth's surface quickly and easily. Most people don't know where they are in latitude and longitude. So most people can't answer a simple question like, what is at latitude 34 north, 24 degrees, 42.7 minutes? What is at 100? And the answer is my house, but you don't know that. Similarly, I can ask the same question based on UTM or on a national grid reference. If I asked you, of course, based on street address, you could tell me instantly that's my house. So what we've developed very successfully over the past decade or so is the ability to interchange all of these methods of referencing, so that by specifying a street address, we can now go instantly to a dot on the map. That's essential if one wants this world of volunteer geographic information to work, because typically people cannot, out of their heads, provide detailed latitude and longitude references. Another technology that's often used is many of the coordinates in these systems are simply read from Google Earth, and I'll come back to that later, and many of them are obtained by GPS. In effect, we have solved the georeferencing problem. As a result, we can do these wonderful VGI things that we would not have been able to do otherwise. Another interesting technology is service-oriented architecture, and this is the notion that information, geographic information, is increasingly dynamic and that it flows around the world through websites, through sites which provide services that add value to the information. And I think the best thing to do is to go quickly to an example, so here's one. This is a service called the Advanced Emergency GIS, which was built by ESRI and the Loma Linda Medical University Center. And you're looking at a standard web browser displaying part of, this is east of Los Angeles, it's the Inland Empire. And each of these icons is a service related to some feature at that point. So this icon here, for example, represents a helicopter. And if I were to click on it, I would get details of that helicopter. What is the helicopter carrying? The location is refreshed every 5 seconds, so this helicopter will literally move across the screen. So if you were an emergency manager, this, in effect, is your situation room. And it's fed by numerous sources. This source here, for example, is a camera on a freeway. It's this icon here, which, as soon as I click on it, opens up a video, real-time video of that part of the freeway network. So here's the same idea in another application. This is in a real application involving a series of fires that broke out in the fall of 2007 in Southern California. These are the real-time footprints of the fires. And these are, every icon reflects some information source, which if I click on it will open up to tell me exactly what's happening. So for example, this icon here is the emergency room at a hospital. If I click on it, it will tell me exactly how many beds are available at that hospital. Here's the schematic of what's happening. Around the periphery, you have various sources of information which are being polled at frequencies which depend on the nature of the information. So if it's a moving helicopter every 5 seconds, if it's a base map every couple of months. And all of this is assembled and then sent to the user, who is able to see a dynamic picture. Some of these require quite sophisticated services. So if we took this one, for example, this is a web page maintained by the California Highway Patrol, and on it is a record of every traffic incident which is current on the freeway network or on the highway network. But the information is posted in text, plain text. So we need to use some kind of a service to search through that text for geographic references, convert them to latitude and longitude, and then display them on the screen. And that service is provided independently, so information is flowing from the CHP site through this site which does this work to the central server. And that pattern is repeated in many places around the periphery. So essentially this is GIS gone real time. This is geographic information flowing in real time through real-time services. This is not the leisurely pace of traditional GIS, where we might have 2 years to complete a project, to collect all the data, and in that 2 years we assume essentially that the world remains static. This is a very dynamic view of the world, a very different view from the traditional one. Another example of a similar kind of thing. This is a lovely website. You may have visited it. It's part of the Huffington Post site. It's called Fundrace. And this is a screenshot I took some months ago showing, it's centered on my house. It's a Google Maps mashup. And every one of these icons is one of my neighbors who at that time, by that point, had given money to the Barack Obama campaign, including details of the name of the person, their profession, their street address, the amount they'd given, and when they'd given it. The interesting thing here is that this data set is, by law, open and public in the United States. But nobody had paid very much attention to it at the individual level until someone had the wonderful idea of putting it behind a map and making it locally relevant. And that's, of course, one of the themes in all of this. It's the local relevance which makes it of interest, motivates people to participate, motivates people to make use of this kind of information. Another technology is geotagging. This is the technology of inserting invisible codes into web text that are geographic references. So many excuse me, many Wikipedia entries now have these, and so one can go to sites which show the locations of all of those Wikipedia entries. If you were interested in Alsace-Lorraine, you might click on this icon and it would open up and give you the Wikipedia entry for that point. So geotagging has allowed cross-referencing between websites based on geographic location. I understand, actually, that there is a site you can go to purchase one of these symbols as a 10-foot high cardboard cutout that you can then take and put it in your front lawn and get your neighbor's attention. There are interesting accidents occur as a result of this. I'd recommend, if you have time, to visit the small village of Boston, New York, which, if you go to various websites, is the center of a cluster of these symbols. Because there are many references on the web to a list of cities in which Boston and New York appear separated by a comma. And it's not sufficiently simple for someone to sort out the difference between them. And so as a result, Boston, New York has suddenly become famous. Behind this are a number of concepts, and let me briefly review some of them. There's the spatial data infrastructure concept, which I referred to earlier. The idea of a patchwork, that traditionally maps produced by the USGS have been uniform in their coverage of the United States, equitable in their coverage of every place. This is a different world in which places of more importance are covered in greater detail, covered more currently. In other words, the level of spatial detail is determined by local demand and by local supply. This is a world of independent contributions from many, many different people, integrated with software, edge-matched, and in which one of the primary purposes of IT is to overcome differences and ambiguities rather than smoothing them out. I remember when my eldest child was born, and the province of Ontario at the time was using an early computing system which required no more than 8 characters in the person's last name. And so my eldest daughter was registered as Goodchild and not Goodchild. That letter simply had to be truncated. These days we would have no tolerance for that kind of thing. We expect IT to accommodate our differences instead of imposing itself on them. I think a very important perspective on this is to think of it in terms of what are called sensor networks. And sensor networks are very much in vogue in the scientific community, but are usually thought of as inert, fixed sensors distributed over the Earth's surface. So there are projects, for example, that distribute sensors over hydrologic networks, sensors over the floor of the Pacific, sensors over systems that we want to constantly gather data from. But we can also think of sensors carried on moving objects, and we have a very interesting project in Santa Barbara right now to track vehicles moving containers in and out of the ports of LA Long Beach. And we're working up to 500 vehicles with GPS transponders on them. You can think of putting a sensor on an individual and then watching that individual as he or she moves around the city, tracking things like air pollution levels. Some very interesting sites that do this. Sites, for example, involved in asthma research that constantly monitor the level of air pollution being experienced by a moving person. But there's a third kind of sensor network, and that's the network of the human beings themselves. Because it seems to me that with more than 6 billion of us, and all of us intelligent, all of us equipped with senses, and all of us informed, we have an enormously powerful source of rich local knowledge. All it takes is the ability to synthesize that knowledge, upload it, and redistribute it. The 6 billion of us are distributed all over the planet, and in essence, in many ways, we are better at synthesizing knowledge than any number of inert sensors. So thinking of humans themselves as sensors, I think, is a very interesting line of thought. And that's, of course, the line of thought that lies behind the concept of citizen science. And this is the idea of networks of amateur observers, possibly trained, possibly skilled, but dedicated to collecting information about the environment. And the Christmas bird count is a classic example run by the Audubon Society. Thousands of local volunteers. In this case, of course, having substantial knowledge, the ability to recognize birds by species, but at the same time amateurs who are contributing voluntarily to the accumulation of what's now a very significant source of ecological data. Project Globe is somewhat comparable. This is an international network of school children, 10,000 schools worldwide, where the children report environmental conditions. And then these are uplinked, synthesized, and redistributed. In all of these, I think one should think about who is participating, and that, of course, varies, because some of these sites are open to everybody. Everybody can contribute to Wikimapia or Flickr. Some of them require some level of skill and training, such as the Christmas bird count. Some of them, school children. Some of them are vehicle fleets. Our project in the ports of LA Long Beach, the INRIX project, which has 500,000 vehicles on US highways acting as real-time probes of traffic conditions. Farmers with precision agriculture who, by mounting a sensor on a tractor, will gather information which is more detailed and more valuable than could be possibly provided by the US Department of Agriculture. All of these then reversing the traditional top-down flow of geographic information. I think one of the most interesting potentials here, if one thinks of individuals as sensors, is early warning of conditions. And think, for example, of recent events such as the Indian Ocean tsunami or Hurricane Katrina. Recently, in the fires in 2007, for example, in California, a very significant source of real-time information was reports from citizens. Reports that consisted perhaps of nothing more than text messages from cell phones, perhaps a photograph, perhaps a video. These became quite useful sources of information. Think of the Indian Ocean tsunami, because my recollection is that we heard early on about the damage to the coast of Thailand, about the damage to the coast of Sri Lanka, but we heard nothing until quite late about damage to cities like Banda Aceh. And yet there were people there on the ground all the time. And many of those people had cell phones. Half of the world's population now has access to a cell phone. Many of them could have been useful sources of very early information about damage. And yet, in reality, we had to wait several days for the official information to become available in the form of satellite information such as this. It's true, I believe, and I got this from Andrew Smith, who works with Map Action, that the first map available for searching the rescue operation in Banda Aceh was this. It was literally drawn on the back of a napkin. And it was many days before official imagery became available, before the skies cleared, the satellites flew over, and we got the official information. So think about the potential here of individuals as reporters providing early damage assessments, providing early information about the locations of individuals. Think about the potential of this sort of technology, for example, in the Zhenjiang earthquake in China earlier this year. That said, of course, the digital divide looms throughout much of this. Discussing VGI implies a level of connectivity that's preferably broadband for both uplink and downlink. But a very interesting research question, I think, is what can you achieve with nothing more than a cell phone and text? One of my grad students has worked up an example where you can take your cell phone, enter a street address, and then within seconds see it pop up on a Google Earth display. The ability to do that is now there. What's missing is simply the will and the tools, the social tools, to synthesize information coming from many different sources. In all of this, the Roman alphabet is dominant. There are problems with diacriticals, problems with translations across languages. I'm very interested in a website. It's actually in Wisconsin. I'm sorry, Bob. A website put together by a woman in Wisconsin which helps you pronounce Wisconsin place names. You go to her site, you pick a place name, and it pronounces it for you. Think of the power of that. Think of the power of an audio interface to Google Earth. So that instead of spelling a place name and having to deal with all the difficulties of alphabets and transliterations, you simply spoke the place name Beijing. Speech and the pronunciation of place names is far more interoperable than any kind of text rendering of place names. Perhaps this is finally the place where sound will become relevant to geographic information. I think we've generally, over the past 40 years, almost completely failed to identify ways in which sound can be used in the context of geographic information. Very important research question: why do people do this? Is it self-promotion? Is it a kind of exhibitionism? Is this the latest version of the webcam in the bathroom? This is information, I think, which stands in sharp contrast to the lack of willingness of people to provide information to regular sources such as the census. Every census, it is increasingly difficult to get people to respond. And yet here is people volunteering information. In many cases, information which is quite personal. What is the difference? And I think one difference is that in all these cases, the identity of the individual stays with the information. So Facebook, for example, Flickr, for example, every photograph entered in Flickr is identified with an individual. You retain some kind of ownership. There's no ownership when you respond to the census. The information instantly becomes anonymous. There's a degree of altruism here, a belief that people contributing information that will be used to good effect, that it will be found and used, a desire to fill gaps in the available data, and a desire in many cases to get around the problems of security. For example, in India, Google is sponsoring the mapping of 50 Indian cities by volunteers. Because in India, geographic information is a matter of national security, and individual access to geographic information is extremely restricted. So this is a way of getting around the traditional restraints. And of course, sharing information with friends and relatives, but in most of these cases, the information that's provided is accessible to everybody. So to summarize, I think what I've been talking about is a very significant contribution to geography. It's a way of enhancing our knowledge of the Earth. It's a way of bringing focus down to the local level and engaging citizens. It's geography for all in a way that GIS really has never been. It leaves, though, many unresolved questions. Questions of trust, questions of credibility. Who is going to preserve this stuff? Come back in 5 years and what will have happened to all those photographs in Flickr? Will they still be there? What's the social psychology? What makes people do this? Who is going to do it? Is this an activity of undergraduates? Is it an activity of high school students? Is it an activity of the retired? We don't know at this point. And I think, perhaps most interestingly, many of these sites emphasize the kinds of geographic information which can be easily provided. This is the low-hanging fruit. Place names, streets, pictures. These are things that everybody is familiar with. So it raises the interesting question, are there types of information which will always require the work of experts? Will, for example, gathering information on soils always require expertise in the form of a degree in pedology? Is there any role for the amateur in the creation of soil maps? And I think about this from the perspective of a gardener. And I think, I want to know about the soil in my garden. And I go to the best available source, which is a US Department of Agriculture map, in which my garden sits in the middle of a 1 square kilometer polygon. And I go to the legend, and I'm faced with a lengthy paragraph of description in which terms like mostly and vague and mostly and normally show up repeatedly. In other words, the legend is extremely vague. And I think I need a degree in pedology just to interpret the soil map, let alone to make one. But all I really wanted to know was what's the quality of the soil in my garden, and will it grow vegetables? And the best source of that is the person in the next garden. So perhaps the soil map was never really the right solution in the first place. Perhaps the soil map as we know it was the result of a complex set of technological and economic constraints, was in fact the only thing we could do in the old world of limited geographic technology. And today, perhaps other solutions are perfectly reasonable. The farmer, for example, needing to employ precision agriculture, is going to collect the essential information for himself or herself by putting sensors on the tractors and the combine harvesters. Not going to use USDA data, which is far too coarse. So here again is information created by the individual for the individual or neighboring individuals. So what I'm really doing, I think, is questioning many aspects of the process, traditional process of the production of geographic information, and saying, I think we should ask to what extent those arrangements were the result of economic constraints and technological constraints which are no longer there. This has led many people to promote the concept of neo-geography, a very interesting world in which all distinction between expert and non-expert disappears. We are all geographers. Very interesting concept for the professional geographer. Are we paleogeographers by contrast? What is our role as professional geographers? Has it gone away? A very interesting question. I think what it reflects in many ways is a failure on the part of professional geographers to explain what they do and why it's important. And let me just ask it in this form of the kinds of expertise that are actually involved in this process of creation of geographic information. Expertise in measurement. We used to need to be surveyors to understand the sextant and the compass and the tape and the total station in order to make maps. These days anybody can do it because you can read it off a GPS. So that kind of expertise is no longer needed. We used to need to be experts in cartography to make maps, but as I argued earlier, the cartographic expertise is now embedded in the software. So we don't need that kind of expertise anymore. We used to need expertise in the subject matter, and perhaps we still do for things like soil maps. But many of those kinds of expertise, I think, have gone away. The one kind of expertise that's still remaining is local expertise. To understand or produce geographic information, you've got to be a local expert. And that's, of course, what we all are, whether or not we have degrees in geography. We're familiar with local areas. And one time when I had nothing better to do, I made this map, which was a map of every county in the United States that I had entered on the ground. And it's approximately 43% of all the counties. But what it really represents is my local expertise. Those counties I know something about from first-hand experience. Every other county, all of the yellow counties, I only know about because I've heard from somebody else, because I've received information from somebody else about them. So all of us have local expertise in some form. All of us are qualified in that sense to make maps and gather geographic information. Let's come back to this contrast I set up at the beginning between authority, traditional production of geographic information, and assertion. So traditional mapping is to high quality, it's authoritative. Instead, sites like Wikimapia are using a process rather like Wikipedia, where anyone can edit, things are reviewed by volunteers, things are put in the context of a Google Map interface. This is crowdsourcing. It's a very different world. And one thing I think that one should certainly recognize is that the methods of assessing quality will be different in both cases. All of our map-producing agencies have very formal methods of assessing quality. But in the case, for example, of Wikimapia or other OpenStreetMap, a potential measure of quality is how many people had the chance to edit. The best quality entries in Wikipedia, for example, are the entries that a lot of people care about. And the entries out on the periphery, like entries about me, for example, that very few people care about, are not edited very effectively. The errors where they exist in Wikipedia are around the periphery, not in the core. And I think the same principle will probably apply to geographic data. But what this does open up is the potential for hybrids, for a collaboration between the authoritative process and the assertive process. And that's, I think, become very interesting. USGS is now sponsoring something called MapCore, a similar organization in the UK. Companies like Navtech and TeleAtlas use networks of volunteers to ensure that their data are correct and up to date. In other words, this is a combination of the old authoritative process and assertion. Just to give a few examples in this contrast here, here's Google Earth. This is the campus of UCSB. And this is a high-resolution image. It was aerial photography that I very carefully registered to the Earth and then superimposed. And you will notice that there is an approximately 15-meter offset to the west between the two. And you may notice that Google's own roads layer, represented here, for example, is similarly offset from the actual road by about 15 meters. We conclude that Google's image registration is off by 15 meters. Anybody who used Google Earth to determine the latitude and longitude will have inherited that error. In essence, this is the Google datum, not WGS 84. And you'll notice that the street names fit my streets perfectly, because the source of the street names is Navtech, and Navtech's accuracy is typically better than 5 meters, whereas the Google Earth registration is 15 meters. So here's an example, and many people would point to this and say, well, you can't trust Google, they're not going to get it right because they're not the US Geological Survey. But go to the USGS. And of course it gets worse, because here is the roads layer in the national map, and here is the DOQ layer behind it, and they're offset. And of course they're offset, because the roads layer is derived from 1 to 24,000 mapping, which has an accuracy standard of 12 meters, and these differences are well within the 12-meter offset. The DOQ is registered as 6 meters, and so potentially there's an 18-meter difference between them. So yes, this is authority, and no, if you subject it to displays like this, it will not look any better than Google. And here is the national map, centered just west of Santa Barbara. And literally, this is what you get when you ask the US Geological Survey for a map of that part of the world. Notice that the roads layer crosses this boundary perfectly, and so does the digital coastline, but the two raster graphics miss each other quite substantially. If you're thinking about this, it would help if I tell you that that's the 120th meridian, which is a UTM zone boundary, and whoever put the national map together didn't bother to resample the rasters when you have an intervening UTM zone boundary, so they don't fit. But the vector data fits perfectly because it doesn't have to be resampled. So the basic message is I don't think there is any reason necessarily to mistrust volunteered information or to trust authoritative information to a point that goes beyond the authoritative information's own standards of accuracy. Underneath this, then, I think is quite a substantial research agenda. There are technical issues here. How do you conflate different sources of information? How do you partially correct and update the standards that it takes to make this world come together? Metadata questions, quality control and assurance. Very rich, I think, research agenda. But there's also a very rich social agenda. The social psychology of trust. Who participates in this? What does it mean to have local expertise? What does it mean to be an expert in, for example, the mapping of soils? And what about privacy and access rights? So all of these, I think, combine to make this a very rich and fruitful agenda. So let me just quickly summarize with a few points. This is a very rapidly changing world. This is a world that would have appeared very strange to its former leaders. If you came back into this world of 2008, you would find the world of geographic information very strange. Because 20 years ago, we would have believed entirely in the authoritative system, that the USGS would simply expand in response to growing demand. This is a world in which the general public is becoming engaged, whether they call themselves neo-geographers or whether it's simply a willingness to volunteer. And this, I think, is an enormous opportunity for the discipline of geography. This is our first real major opportunity to engage the world of professional geography with the world of the average citizen. It raises a very interesting question of who are the experts in the geographic world. In a sense, we are all local experts, and many of the traditional kinds of expertise that we needed to create geographic information have gone away. And this is, I think, a much more dynamic view of geography than we've had in the past. A sharp change from the rather leisurely pace at which GIS projects have been conducted in the past. This really does open up the possibility that this world will become dynamic and real-time. And that, of course, is very appropriate in a world which is changing more and more rapidly. So thank you very much for your attention.